That was Taliesin playing Fading Colors, a piece he composed last year when he began to learn cello. And this is our first episode of an occasional series we call Pisatuk, a father and son sharing storytelling and crafts. And I'm Chris, and you just heard Taliesin. And we're going to start today's episode with a couple of stories. The first one is a favorite family story, I suppose, and Taliesin's going to tell it. And here you go.
Hi, so I'm going to tell you a story about a farmer, his son, and a horse that ran away. So, it starts off with this farmer. He has a son and a horse to help him out on the farm. But then one day, the horse ran away. And all his neighbors came to say their sympathies and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, that's quite unlucky that your horse ran away and now you only have your son to help you on the farm." So, then the farmer said, "We'll see." And a few days later, the horse came back, but with two wild horses. So, then, all his neighbors came to say, "Oh, you're so lucky, your horse ran away," but then comes back with two more wild horses? Woohoo! And so, the farmer said, "We'll see." But then, one day, his son was trying to train one of the wild horses, but then the wild horse flung the son off its back, and the son broke his leg. And so then all his neighbors came to check on his son to see if he's doing okay and say, "Ooh, that's so unlucky." Yeah. And the farmer said, "We'll see." And then, a couple weeks later, the army came to town, drafting all the young, able soldiers, young, able men to go fight in the war. And when the army went past the farmer's house, they didn't take his son because of his broken leg. And all the neighbors came to say the farmer how lucky he was, for they knew they weren't going to see some of those family members again. And the farmer said, "We'll see."
All right. That's an old Chinese story as far as I know. And I've known it longer than I can remember from where I originally learned it, and pass it on to first Taliesin's cousin Renee, who loved it as a child, and then Taliesin has loved it and as you can see, tells it. I'm going to tell you a Scottish story I learned from Duncan Williamson. Duncan was a traveler, a member of a nomadic people who live in the British Isles. And I was very lucky to meet Duncan many years ago when I spent a week with him on his visit to Canada. I was his driver and chaperone, I suppose. And I'd already read many of his stories and learned more while he was here, and this remains one of my favorites. And it's called Duncan McKinnon and the Seal. Once, long ago, there was a seal hunter named Duncan McKinnon. And he would go out every day from his small cottage by the cliffs over the ocean to go out and hunt seals. In good weather and bad, in all seasons of the year, he would hunt seals. That's what he did. There is one thing, however, he never did, and that was to hunt or kill the baby seals. Now, whether or not that was because he pitied them or because he knew that those baby seals would grow up to be bigger seals with bigger coats, we don't know. It's true, though, that he never killed the baby seals. Now, for Duncan, sometimes times were good and his sealskins were very popular and people came and bought most or all of his sealskins, and at other times, not so good. And this story happens when it was one of the not so good times, and Duncan found himself with a cottage filled with sealskins for which nobody had showed any interest. And so he still, however, went out and hunted every single day. It was his practice. But having such a surplus of sealskins, he decided that it was worth going out in the ocean further than he usually went. It was a long trip, but he knew that the trip was often worthwhile, as dangerous as it was. For there was a huge rock very far out from all the others, the furthest he could get to with his boat. But on that rock, he knew that sometimes the biggest seals came to lie in the sun. And so he prepared for his day and went out on his boat, and sure enough, after a long while that day, he came to the rock. And as he got closer and closer, he saw that his trip had been worthwhile, for he could see on the far side of the rock the shoulder of a great gray silver seal. And so, as the hunter he was, he slipped his boat very quietly up to the rock, slipped out of his boat as quietly, and crawled to the top of the rock where he could see down to the seal that was bathing there in the sun. And as was his practice, he took out his large hunting knife. It was a beautiful knife with a mother-of-pearl handle, and it fit his hand so well. And he lifted it, and he positioned himself and got as close to the seal as he could and brought his hand with the knife in it down for what he knew would be a killing stroke. However, at the last second, the seal rolled away. Duncan's knife sank into its shoulder, and the seal continued to roll, pulling the knife out of Duncan's hand. And Duncan watched as the seal slipped into the water, his knife sticking out of the back of the seal, and the seal trailing a line of blood as it swam away and disappeared under the waves. Well, Duncan knew better than to waste any time. And as much as it was his favorite knife, it was another day of hunting for him, and these things happened. And so he turned around, got into his boat, and went home. Now that evening, as he prepared himself a wee meal, there was a knock on his cottage door. And that was strange, for his cottage was at the end of the road, far from the village, and on the way to nowhere. So who could possibly be knocking on his door at this time of night? He opened the door and was surprised for a moment, for all he saw was blackness, and even on the darkest night he could see the stars or the reflection of the moon on the waves, but here he was looking only at blackness and didn't understand it for a moment when he noticed that the blackness moved, and he realized that standing in his door was a very tall person taking up the entirety of the door. And that's when Duncan heard a voice that said, "Are you Duncan McKinnon, the seal hunter?" And Duncan said, I am. And who are you? And the voice said, "My master is interested in your sealskins." And Duncan immediately forgot if there was anything strange going on. He just said, "You're interested in my sealskins? Then please, come in. For it had been a long time since he had sold any sealskins. And he watched as the stranger had to bend down to get through the low door of Duncan's cottage. And when the stranger stood up, Duncan admired the black coat that he was wearing and looked to see where the coat ended and the boots began, for the boots seemed to be made of the same black fur of some kind. And when Duncan looked up to see the face of the stranger, he couldn't see the face, for the face was hidden in the shadow of the brim of a very large hat that also seemed to be made of the same fur. And Duncan pointed to the wall of his cottage, and he and the stranger looked, and there on the wall of the cottage was a rack as long as the cottage itself, filled with sealskins. Well, the stranger walked over, And he touched the sealskins and ran his thumb down each of the sealskins. And he did this with all of the sealskins, dozens of them. And he took his time. And when he was done, he turned and said to Duncan, "My master wants to buy all of your sealskins." And Duncan was pleased to hear that. This was quite unusual. And he said, "Well, where is your master? Bring him, and I will be glad to set a very fair price." Well, the stranger said, "My master waits down by the edge of the cliff where the road goes into town." And Duncan said, "Very well. Well, bring me to him then, and I will meet him." The stranger walked out of the cottage, and Duncan followed, eager to make this sale. And he followed the stranger down the path, and he looked ahead to where the path joined the road that went into town, and he saw nobody waiting. And he walked right up to the path, and now looking out over the ocean, he was about to turn and ask the stranger where his master had got to. And before he could turn, the stranger came up quickly behind Duncan, grabbed Duncan across the chest with one arm, slapped his other arm and hand across Duncan's mouth and nose, and jumped off the cliff. They plunged down and down and down. Duncan barely had a moment to be startled, but his fear began to rise, and he thought that he was about to die, when the stranger, holding Duncan so tightly, smashed into the ocean. And immediately the stranger began to swim strongly straight down. And before a few seconds, they were now swimming across the floor of the ocean. And Duncan was his panic rising and rising. He was terrified when he found himself thrust through a wall of water, which was also a wall of air, and the stranger let him go, and Duncan found himself on his hands and knees, gasping for air and still in a panic. And he looked to see that he was on sand underneath the ocean. And when he stood up, he saw that there was a wall of water that was being held up by the air that was in what he now knew to be a tunnel. He turned, and he could see that the tunnel went off into the distance, and it was lined with torches on both sides, as far as his eye could see. But before he could do anything else, the stranger pushed him roughly from behind and said, "Walk." And Duncan walked and walked. And when he slowed or stumbled, the stranger pushed him roughly again. Duncan didn't know how long he walked along that tunnel between those lines of torches, but eventually the tunnel opened up into a great cavern. And Duncan looked to see that the cavern was filled with people, men and women, boys and girls, as far as the eye could see, all sitting on stone benches. From side to side and front to back, the cavern was filled with people. And as he looked at them closely, he saw that they all had the great, big, gentle brown eyes of seals. Now Duncan had heard the stories of the seal people, the Selkies, who could take off their sealskins and become people, but he thought they were just children's stories. He never believed for a second that they were real. And yet here he was, surrounded by all these people, Selkies every one. Now his panic and fear grew even stronger. And again, the stranger pushed him roughly from behind, and Duncan had to stumble across the cavern floor amidst all of those people sitting there, until he came to the far side of the cavern, where he now saw a great stone chair, and in it, seated, a very, very large man, who sat on the chair, holding his head with one hand and clearly in a lot of pain. Duncan looked at the man in the chair and then looked back at the stranger, and the stranger said, "Duncan McKinnon, you have wounded our king." And Duncan looked back at the man, and now the man leaned forward just a little bit, and Duncan could see, sticking out of the man's shoulder, the handle of the knife that he had lost that very morning. Well, he turned again to the stranger and said, what am I to do?" And the stranger said, "Duncan, you have wounded our king, and only you can heal our king." And Duncan didn't know what that meant, but the stranger said, "Duncan, you must remove the knife from the king's back." And Duncan knew that he had to do what he was told, even though he knew that his life was likely soon to end. But he reached his hand forward, and it was trembling as he reached over the shoulder of the Seal King. And he put his fingers around the knife that he had held that very morning. And he pulled it out, and it slipped out easily enough. But now Duncan saw that the wound oozed blood and pus, and he turned to hand the knife to the stranger, but the stranger shooed him away and said, "Duncan, you must now kiss the wound." Well, Duncan looked at that wound. It was an ugly wound, and he was afraid, but he knew he had to do what he was told, and so he leaned forward and very, very gently kissed the edges of the wound. And as he straightened up, he watched as the wound healed and the skin sealed up and was as smooth within seconds as if it had never been cut. And now the king of the Seal people sat up and he looked at Duncan and he said, "Duncan McKinnon, you are no friend of the Seal people. However, there is one thing for which we are grateful, and that is that you have never killed any of our children. And for that, we thank you." And the king made a motion with his hand, and a little boy ran off and came back within seconds and handed something to the king, who handed it to Duncan. It was a leather pouch, very heavy. And before Duncan could think or ask anything, the king said, "Now go." And Duncan turned. And this time the stranger, who had shoved him so roughly along the tunnel and across the cavern, gestured gently and showed Duncan the way across the cavern, and then walked with him through the tunnel until they came to the wall of water. And Duncan was about to turn and ask what he was to do when the stranger came up behind him and slapped his hand across his chest and his other hand across his mouth and nose, and leapt into the water, where he swam strongly and quickly straight to the surface and the beach below the cliff below Duncan's cottage. And he threw Duncan onto the beach and was gone. Duncan, gasping and cold there in the nighttime, gathered himself and made his way up to his cottage. And then he went in and changed his clothes, and when he was dry, he went over to the table and looked at the leather pouch that the Seal people had given him. Well, he opened the leather pouch and found that it was filled with gold coins. And as he examined them, he could see gold coins that were hundreds of years old from Spain and other countries. And he knew that these were some of the treasures that the Seal people had collected in their journeys under the sea. He looked up and only then noticed that all the seal skins in his cottage were gone. And he nodded. And the next day, he sold his cottage. And with the money from the sale of his cottage and the gold coins, the treasure that the Seal people had given him, he moved to the Isle of Skye, to the west side of the Isle of Skye and the north side, where he bought some land, and there he spent the rest of his days and hunted seals never again. However, the seals were always safe to come and bathe in the sun on his land. And Duncan made sure they were protected. And if you ever go to the Isle of Skye and you know where to find Duncan's land, you may see the seals bathing in the sun there to this day. That's the story of Duncan McKinnon and the Seal people. So, friends and neighbors, Talis and I will try and do more of these videos of stories. Some of you parents can use these stories as bedtime stories for your children. If you are, if your kids have been in Palmerston with Taliesin, then they may have heard this story and might appreciate hearing it again in this different form. And Taliesin and I will share more stories and some of the crafts that we like to do. Our house is like an art studio, and we are constantly making things. And so we'll share some of that to help us weather this strange time of social distancing, or physical distancing, as some people are calling it, so that we really should stay connected socially. It's a tough time, and our hearts go out to everybody. And now to bring this first wee production to a close, Taliesin is going to treat us to another piece he's learned in his cello studies. Here you go.
Yeah, I think it's time to end with a exciting finish, so.
That is popcorn. That's something you might know. Google Swedish Chef and popcorn. You'll thank us for it. Thank you, and have a good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you happen to be watching this.